Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into one of the most uniquely terrible jobs in the entire history of human civilization. You are a medieval plague doctor, and before this night is over, you will have worn a bird mask stuffed with dried flowers, prescribed a remedy made mostly of hope and superstition, and walked directly into the kind of suffering that would make a modern emergency room physician weep into their stethoscope. You probably won't survive this, not because we're being dramatic, but because statistically, a significant number of your real-life counterparts simply didn't. The Black Death did not really care about your professional credentials. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. Whether you're in rainy London at midnight or a sweltering Sydney afternoon, I want to know. We're all in this cozy little community together, even if tonight's topic is decidedly less cozy than usual. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are somewhere in 14th century Europe, let's say it's 1348, because why not start at the absolute worst possible moment? And you have just been hired as a plague doctor. Congratulations. Truly. This is what career success looks like in the Middle Ages, and honestly, it says a lot about your options that you said yes. Before you can do anything useful, before you can visit a single patient or collect a single coin, you have to put on the uniform. And the uniform, my friend, is a piece of work. Let's start at the top, literally, with the hat. It's wide-brimmed, made of waxed leather, dark and stiff and faintly ridiculous looking, like something a very serious scarecrow might wear to a funeral. The brim is wide enough to keep rain off your face, which is practical, and wide enough to make you look vaguely threatening from a distance, which turns out to be accidentally useful. People tend to give you a wide berth when you walk through the village, and honestly, given what you're walking toward, that is a mercy for everyone involved. Beneath the hat, your face disappears into a mask. And here is where things get truly interesting. The mask is shaped like a bird, specifically like a crow or a raven, with a long curved beak that juts forward from your face like some sort of ghoulish carnival prop. The beak is not decorative. Well, it's a little bit decorative, but its primary function is practical in the most medieval way imaginable. Inside that beak, packed as tightly as the space allows, is a mixture of aromatic substances. Dried flowers, lavender, roses, carnations, along with herbs like mint and thyme, and sometimes more exotic things like camphor, cloves, or ambergris if someone was feeling fancy. The idea was that these sweet-smelling materials would filter the air before it reached your nose and lungs, protecting you from the miasma. The miasma, that's the key concept here, and it's going to follow you through every single day of your career as a plague doctor. Miasma theory, the belief that disease is caused by bad air, specifically the foul, rotting air that emanates from decomposing bodies, swamps, sewage, and basically anything unpleasant, was the dominant medical paradigm of the medieval world. It wasn't a fringe idea. It wasn't the medieval equivalent of a conspiracy theory. It was the mainstream, academically endorsed, medically respectable explanation for why disease spread. Germ theory, the actual correct explanation, was still centuries away. So the beak full of flowers made complete sense to the people who designed it. If bad air causes plague, then good-smelling air should counter it. Filtered through lavender and cloves, the logic was airtight. Or so they believed. The mask's eyes are made of glass, round, dark, slightly tinted, because of course they are, and they give you the look of a creature from somewhere between this world and the next. When you peer out through those glass lenses, the world takes on a faintly smoky, amber-tinged quality, like looking at everything through a very old bottle. Children run from you. Adults cross themselves when you pass. Dogs bark and then go quiet, which is somehow worse. You look like death walking, which is either deeply appropriate or terribly ironic, depending on how you choose to look at it. Beneath the mask and hat, you are wrapped head to toe in a long outer garment, a waxed or oiled canvas robe that falls to your ankles. The wax coating is meant to repel the miasma. It's always the miasma. But it also, helpfully, repels a certain amount of actual liquid contamination. Medieval medicine stumbled backward into practical hygiene sometimes, like a person who trips and accidentally falls into the right answer. The robe is heavy and stiff and hot, especially in summer, which is, delightfully, exactly when plague tends to be at its worst. You will sweat inside this garment in a way that will fundamentally change your relationship with the concept of personal comfort. Your hands are gloved, leather, thick, reaching up past your wrists, and you carry a long wooden stick or cane, typically around 4 to 5 feet long. The stick has a specific function. It allows you to examine patients, move clothing, lift coverings, and point at things without actually touching them with your hands. This is, once again, medieval medicine accidentally being correct about something for the wrong reasons. You're not avoiding contact because you understand vectors of bacterial transmission. You're avoiding contact because you believe miasma clings to surfaces and to skin, and direct touch might transfer that poisonous quality to you. The conclusion is right. The science is wrong. The 14th century would like credit for the result anyway. The full ensemble hat, beak mask, glass eyes, waxed robe, leather gloves, wooden stick is known in later historical literature as the costume of the plague doctor, and it has become one of the most iconic images of the medieval period. It appears in art, in carnival masks in Venice, in modern Halloween costumes and steampunk aesthetics and Gothic imagery. Historians still argue whether the full-beaked costume was universally worn by all plague doctors or whether it developed gradually and was more common in some regions than others. Contemporary illustrations are inconsistent, and written descriptions vary enough to make a definitive answer elusive. What's clear is that some version of protective clothing was widely used, and that the beaked mask was associated with plague doctors strongly enough to become symbolic of the entire profession. What nobody tells you, what the history books gloss over in favor of the aesthetics, is how the costume actually feels to wear. It is brutally uncomfortable. The leather of the beak mask presses against your cheeks and forehead with a relentless, low-grade insistence, like a firm handshake from someone who doesn't know when to let go. The glass lenses fog up almost immediately from your own breath, so you are frequently navigating the interior of a plague-stricken medieval home while essentially blind, feeling your way with a stick and relying on your other senses. Your other senses, unfortunately, mostly mean your nose, which is picking up aromatic herbs filtered through warm, stale air that has been recycled inside a leather beak for the past 3 hours. After a while, the lavender and cloves stop smelling like flowers and start smelling like something you could not describe to another person and would very much like to forget. The waxed robe does not breathe. That is perhaps its defining characteristic as a garment. You wear it in summer and winter alike, because plague doesn't take seasons off, and in summer the heat underneath builds to something approaching geological. There are accounts, difficult to verify, which is a phrase you will get very comfortable with in medieval history, of plague doctors fainting inside their protective gear, overcome by heat and exhaustion before they even reached their patients. Whether that's precisely true or a piece of retrospective embellishment is one of those things that lives in the gray zone of historical record, but it is entirely plausible, which is almost as good. The stick you carry is, in practice, more useful than you might expect. You use it to examine the buboes, the swollen, painful lymph nodes in the groin, armpit, and neck that are the signature symptom of bubonic plague. Pressing on them with a stick from a safe distance is about the most advanced diagnostic tool in your kit, which is both depressing and relatable in a certain tired way. You also use it to signal to family members where to stand, to move fabric or hair out of the way when inspecting a patient, and occasionally to keep desperate relatives from grabbing at you when they want answers you cannot honestly give. The stick is part examination instrument, part crowd control, part prop. It is doing a lot of heavy lifting. You are paid by the town or city that has contracted your services. We'll get into the complicated economics of that arrangement soon enough. And part of the deal is that you dress the part. The costume is not optional. It is the uniform of your office, the visual signal to the community that you are the designated person walking toward the plague rather than away from it. It marks you as simultaneously important and untouchable, respected and feared, necessary and deeply, deeply unlucky. When you finally get the whole ensemble on, hat settled, beak strapped in place, gloves pulled up, robe tied at the collar, stick in hand, you stand in the early morning light of a medieval street and take a long, lavender-scented breath and you think, this is fine, this is fine. You are a professional. You are trained. You have read Galen and Hippocrates and you have a very nice hat. And then you walk toward the house with the red cross painted on the door, and your career as a medieval plague doctor officially begins. The smell hits you before you reach the door. This is not a metaphor, and it is not an exaggeration, and it is not the kind of thing that gets easier with experience, despite what your more seasoned colleagues might tell you with that particular dead-eyed expression they've developed over years of doing this job. The smell of a plague house in 14th century Europe is its own complete sensory universe, and you are about to enter it armed with nothing but a beak full of dried lavender and an increasingly fragile sense of professional composure. But here's the thing, and this is important because it gives context to everything else you're about to experience. The smell didn't start with the plague. The plague made it worse, certainly, the way a thunderstorm makes a flood worse. But the underlying conditions, the deep baseline of medieval urban odor, were already extraordinary long before the first flea-bitten rat collapsed in a Genoese alleyway. To understand what you're walking into, you need to understand the olfactory landscape of the world you've chosen to practice medicine in. And that landscape is, there's no graceful way to put this, catastrophic. Medieval cities were not designed with sanitation in mind. This is not a controversial statement. It is one of the great foundational truths of pre-modern urban life, acknowledged cheerfully and extensively by historians, archaeologists, and anyone who has ever spent time reading about what daily life in a medieval city actually involved. Streets in most European cities, London, Paris, Florence, Bruges, take your pick, served simultaneously as thoroughfares, marketplaces, and open sewers. Household waste, including the kind of household waste that modern people prefer to dispose of in private and with running water, was frequently emptied from upper-floor windows directly into the street below, usually with a shouted warning that ranged in politeness depending on the neighborhood. There were designated areas for butchers to conduct their work, and the blood and offal from those activities drained wherever gravity suggested. Tanneries, which processed animal hides into leather, used urine, collected in large public vats, because why not, as part of their process, and they operated in or near populated areas because medieval zoning laws were more of a general suggestion than an enforceable system. Animals lived alongside people in a way that modern urban dwellers would find genuinely startling. Pigs roamed city streets in many European towns and were considered semi-municipal in their function. They ate garbage, which reduced waste accumulation, which was a real sanitation benefit, which tells you something about the available options. Horses, oxen, dogs, cats, and various livestock were constant presences in neighborhoods that were already densely packed with human beings living in close quarters. The manure output of a medieval city was not a minor inconvenience. It was a defining characteristic of the environment, measurable in the archaeological record in layers of compacted organic material that historians can date and analyze and from which they can draw conclusions about population density, animal husbandry, and the general state of everyone's shoes. Water sources were frequently compromised. Wells were dug in close proximity to privies and burial grounds, not because medieval people were indifferent to the connection exactly, but because the science of groundwater contamination was not available to them, and the visual logic of digging your latrine near your water supply was simply that both required a hole in the ground. Germ theory, as mentioned, was centuries away. The concept that invisible organisms could travel through water and cause disease was not part of any intellectual framework available in the 14th century. So water was assessed by appearance and taste and smell, and if it seemed acceptable, it was used, and if it made people sick, the explanation was found elsewhere, in the stars, in God's judgment, in moral failing, in the miasma. Always the miasma. You, as a plague doctor, are a committed miasmatist. You believe, with the full conviction of someone educated in the best medical tradition available to you, that the foul air rising from this city is making people sick. And here is the maddening, almost poetic irony of your situation. You are wrong about the mechanism. It's not the air, it's Yersinia pestis, a bacterium carried by fleas living on rats. But you are right about the correlation. Places that smell terrible in medieval Europe smell terrible because they are full of rotting organic material, accumulated waste, and poor sanitation. Places full of rotting organic material, accumulated waste, and poor sanitation are also excellent environments for rats. Rats carry fleas. Fleas carry plague. So your instinct to associate the stench with the sickness is, in a tragically backwards way, pointing in the right direction. The smell is not the cause, but the conditions that create the smell are the conditions that create the plague. You do not know this. Nobody knows this. You will not know this for another 5 centuries. So you walk through the streets with your beak full of herbs, breathing filtered air, and you feel, in a vague professional way, that you are doing something correct. The city you're navigating is not just smelly. It is densely, intimately, almost incomprehensibly crowded by the standards of a person who has grown up with personal space as a reasonable expectation. Medieval urban housing packed families, extended families, multiple generations, sometimes unrelated lodgers, into small structures with limited ventilation. Windows were small because glass was expensive and because heat retention mattered in cold northern climates. Fires burned indoors for cooking and warmth, filling rooms with smoke, which settled into the walls and the clothing and the hair of everyone who lived there. Rushes or straw were often used as floor covering in poorer homes, spread down to provide insulation and softness, replaced periodically but not obsessively, accumulating food scraps and animal waste and general domestic debris in their lower layers over time. Running your stick along a wall in one of these homes produces a faint skittering in the walls themselves, because the rat population of a medieval city is not a distant outdoor phenomenon. The rats are in the walls. The rats are everywhere. You live alongside them the way you live alongside your neighbors. You know they're there, you'd prefer to think about it as little as possible, and there's genuinely nothing you can do. When you finally push open the door of the plague house, the smell that greets you is the full synthesis of all of this. The baseline urban odor of the medieval street multiplied and concentrated by sickness, by sweat, by the specific and unmistakable smell of a human body fighting an infection it is very likely losing. Plague produces its own particular aromatic signature. The buboes, those swollen lymph nodes, can rupture and weep, and the smell of that process is one that plague doctors described in their writings with a kind of exhausted clinical horror that you can feel across the centuries. There is also the gangrene that sometimes accompanies the septicemic form of plague, where blackened tissue on the fingers and toes produces a smell that explains, at least in part, why that particular form of the disease was called the Black Death. The room is dark. The patient or patients are in various stages of suffering. Family members who have not yet fled, and some will have fled, which you cannot entirely blame them for, look at you with an expression that mingles hope and despair in a ratio you will learn to recognize very quickly. Your lavender beak is working hard. You are grateful for it in a way you were not 10 minutes ago when it was merely uncomfortable. Here is a quirky detail that tends to get left out of the standard historical account. Plague doctors were not just concerned with the patients inside the house. They were also formally tasked in many cities with recording deaths, essentially acting as a primitive public health data collection service. Part of your job is to note the number of dead, report symptoms, and relay information back to municipal authorities who were trying, in their limited way, to track the spread of the epidemic. This makes you something between a physician and a census taker, which is a combination of roles that probably did not feature in whatever passed for your career counseling as a young person in medieval Europe. The record-keeping brought you into rooms and situations beyond ordinary medical visits. You were called to homes where everyone was dead, where the only living things were the rats in the walls and the flies gathering at the window, and your job was to enter, assess, count, and report. No amount of lavender fully addresses that situation. Historians still argue whether the formal data recording role of plague doctors contributed meaningfully to the development of systematic public health practice, or whether it was simply a bureaucratic response to crisis that left no lasting institutional legacy. The historical trail is fragmentary enough that both positions have credible support. The herbs in your beak, meanwhile, are performing a function beyond the theoretical one. The intense aromatic quality of camphor and cloves and dried lavender is actually strong enough to partially mask even the most aggressive medieval odors. Not eliminate them, but overlay them with something your brain can process without triggering the kind of visceral physical response that would make your job literally impossible. You develop, over time, a relationship with these smells that is almost affectionate. Lavender will smell, for the rest of your career, like work, like the particular mixture of duty and dread and low-level nausea that constitutes your professional life. On days off, if you get days off, which is a subject for later, you will walk past a lavender bush in someone's garden and feel something complicated move through you. The miasma theory, wrong as it fundamentally was, did create some behavioral patterns that were not entirely useless. The recommendation to burn aromatic materials, juniper, rosemary, pine, in infected areas produced bonfires in medieval streets that were theoretically clearing the air of pestilence and were actually, incidentally, also reducing the rat and flea population in the immediate vicinity. Heat and smoke are unpleasant for fleas. Nobody knew that was the mechanism. Nobody knew there was a flea mechanism. But the bonfires helped fractionally, and the cities that burned them felt they were doing something, and the something they were doing was, at the molecular level, slightly less wrong than it appeared. You also recommend, as part of your standard practice, that windows be open to let out the bad air and let in the good, a directive that sounds counterintuitive in a miasmatic framework, but which was based on the observation that stagnant air seemed worse than moving air, which is a valid empirical observation even if the explanation attached to it was incorrect. Ventilation, it turns out, genuinely helps with a number of things. Not with bubonic plague, unfortunately, which is not airborne in its primary form. But in a city where respiratory illness, typhus, and a rotating cast of other infections were always circulating alongside the plague, the general recommendation to ventilate living spaces was medically sound even if applied for the wrong reasons. The comedy of errors that is miasma theory, constantly brushing up against correct conclusions for deeply incorrect reasons, is one of the genuinely fascinating threads in the history of medicine. You are living inside that comedy without access to the punchline, doing your best with the tools and framework available to you. There is something both absurd and quietly heroic about that, and somewhere in the back of your lavender-scented consciousness on the better days you can feel it. But mostly you can feel the smell. Presses through the herbs. It finds the gaps in your mask. It settles into the fabric of your waxed robe and lives there, accumulating over days and weeks of house visits, building a personal olfactory record of every patient you've seen, every room you've entered, every family that watched you walk in with your crowbeak and your stick and your glass eyes and your insufficient optimism. The robe is cleaned periodically, soaked in vinegar or boiled or simply aired out in the hope that the smell will go somewhere else, but it never quite reverts to neutral. It holds the history of your practice the way a diary holds words, except instead of words it holds the unmistakable, irreducible smell of medieval plague, and instead of a diary it is a garment you are required to wear every working day. You step fully into the room. You close the door behind you. The family watches you from the shadows, and the patient on the pallet in the corner breathes in the shallow, labored way that you have already learned to assess with a single glance. You push the beak herbs as close to your face as they will go, take a long, careful breath of their dwindling fragrance, and you begin to work. Nobody told you about the negotiation. That is the thing they leave out of whatever passes for a medical education in 14th century Europe. The part where, before you ever set foot in a plague house, before you ever strap on the beak mask or fill it with lavender, you have to sit across a table from a municipal official and haggle over what your life is worth in coin. And the municipal official, who has never personally entered a plague house and does not intend to start now, has a very different opinion about that number than you do. Welcome to the economics of being a medieval plague doctor, which are fascinating, depressing, and occasionally outright insulting in equal measure. The first thing to understand is that plague doctors were not, in most cases, the cream of the medieval medical profession. That is a blunt thing to say, but it is historically accurate, and your own experience will confirm it quickly enough. The physicians who had built wealthy, established practices, the ones treating nobility, attending to the comfortable ailments of prosperous merchants, dispensing dietary advice and astrological consultations to people who could pay well and were unlikely to give you a fatal bacterial infection. Those physicians were, by and large, not rushing to volunteer for plague duty. They had practices to protect, reputations to maintain, and a survival instinct that was perfectly well calibrated to the situation. Some refused outright. Some fled the cities entirely, which caused considerable scandal and also, depending on your level of cynicism, considerable envy. What this meant in practice was that the plague doctors who actually showed up, who accepted the contracts, who put on the costumes and walked into the infected neighborhoods, were frequently younger physicians trying to establish themselves, foreign-trained practitioners without existing local clientele, or doctors whose ordinary practices had been disrupted enough by the epidemic that contract plague work was the most viable option remaining. There were also, frankly, Some people who were simply brave in the specific, quiet way that produces not glory but just the daily grinding act of doing the necessary thing. History doesn't always name them correctly. It tends to name the philosophers and the kings. But the plague doctors were there. The contract negotiation happened at the municipal level in most major European cities. This is one of the more remarkable institutional developments of the plague era. The fact that cities began formally hiring physicians to serve as designated plague doctors, with written contracts specifying duties, pay, and the terms of service. These contracts are among the most valuable primary sources historians have for understanding how plague medicine was actually practiced, because they reveal the practical realities behind the theoretical framework in ways that medical treatises do not. Florence, Venice, Cologne, various French and Spanish cities all developed versions of this contractual system, though the specifics varied considerably. Your contract, if you are lucky, specifies a guaranteed salary paid by the city. This is not nothing. In times of epidemic, when wealthy private patients were either dead, fled, or locked inside their houses refusing to admit anyone, a municipal salary was the difference between eating and not eating. The city needed you. You needed the city. This was, in the most basic economic sense, a functional arrangement. The salary, however, was where the complications began. Cities in the grip of epidemic were not in ideal financial condition. Tax revenues were disrupted because the tax-paying population kept dying. Trade was reduced because merchants were reluctant to enter infected cities. Municipal treasuries that had been adequate before the plague arrived found themselves stretched between the cost of managing the crisis and the reduced income available to fund it. The salary offered to plague doctors reflected this tension. It was often set lower than the physician might have earned in private practice during normal times, justified by the city on the grounds that a contracted position offered stability and a guaranteed income in circumstances where private practice was essentially impossible anyway. Historians still argue whether plague doctors were fairly compensated for the risks they took, or whether municipal authorities systematically underpaid them based on a calculation that desperate circumstances would keep the supply of willing physicians adequate regardless of the wage offered. The surviving contracts suggest significant variation. Some doctors appear to have negotiated quite reasonable terms, while others seem to have accepted conditions that look, from the outside, remarkably exploitative given the nature of the work involved. Then there was the question of additional payments. Beyond the base salary, some plague doctor contracts allowed for fees paid directly by patients or their families. This sounds like a reasonable supplement until you consider the practical reality. The patients most in need of a plague doctor's services were frequently the poorest members of the community, precisely because wealthier people had resources to flee, to isolate, to purchase food and supplies that allowed them to avoid the densest points of infection. The people you spent most of your time treating were the people least able to pay you anything at all. The wealthy patients, when you got them, which was rarer, were sometimes willing to pay significantly for your services, but they also tended to have the social leverage to renegotiate, delay, or simply refuse payment if your treatment failed. And your treatment, you will discover, failed quite a lot. This created what might be called the fundamental economic paradox of plague medicine. The more dangerous your caseload, the worse your pay. High-risk patients in poor neighborhoods, constant exposure, minimal compensation. Lower-risk patients in wealthy households, occasional visits, better payment but also greater scrutiny and more aggressive complaints when the inevitable happened. No good options anywhere on the spectrum. There was also the quarantine problem, which had direct financial consequences you may not have fully thought through when you signed the contract. Many cities required plague doctors to observe a period of quarantine themselves, to refrain from contact with the general, uninfected population for a set period after treating plague patients. This was sound practice in a general sense, even if the theoretical basis for it was, once again, miasmatic rather than epidemiological. The quarantine periods varied. Some contracts specified days, some specified weeks, and some of the more aggressive municipal health boards specified arrangements that essentially amounted to the plague doctor living in a state of semi-permanent isolation for the duration of the epidemic. During quarantine, you could not see private patients. You could not supplement your income. You ate what the city provided and lived where the city told you to live and waited. There is a quirky financial footnote to all of this that tends to delight people when they encounter it. In some documented cases, Cities that could not afford to pay plague doctors in cash offered payment in other forms. Wine was a documented alternative currency in certain contracts, not a trivial thing in a world where wine was both a dietary staple and a medicinal substance. And in at least a handful of recorded instances, plague doctors received portions of their salary in the form of goods confiscated from the estates of those who had died without heirs. Which means that somewhere in the history of medieval plague medicine, there is a physician who went to negotiate a contract about treating the dying and came home with a dead man's furniture and a case of local wine. The medieval economy was nothing if not creative. Your housing situation as a contracted plague doctor was often mandated rather than chosen. Cities that took their public health responsibilities seriously, and by the 14th century, a number of Italian city-states had developed surprisingly sophisticated approaches to epidemic management, sometimes provided designated housing for plague doctors, separate from ordinary residential neighborhoods, with the explicit goal of containing any potential spread from the physician to the general population. This sounds thoughtful, and it was, in a way. It also meant living in accommodation that was frequently basic, often isolated, and chosen for its distance from everyone else rather than for its comfort or convenience. You were the medical equivalent of a fire station, essential infrastructure that everyone was glad existed and nobody particularly wanted next door. The emotional weight of this financial precarity layered on top of the physical danger is difficult to overstate. You were, in the most practical sense, gambling your life for a wage that the city had set based on its own budget constraints rather than on any honest assessment of what the work was worth. You knew this. The municipal officials knew this. The contract was a document that made that transaction official and gave it the dignity of paperwork, which was perhaps the most that could be offered under the circumstances. Some plague doctors found ways to supplement their income that were, let's say, ethically creative. The role of the plague doctor included, in many cities, the official certification of death, confirming that a deceased person had died of plague and not some other cause, which had implications for how the estate was handled and how the family was treated by authorities. This gatekeeping function gave the plague doctor a degree of informal power over grieving families that was occasionally exploited. There are records, fragmentary and difficult to verify with precision, but sufficiently consistent across multiple sources to be credible, of plague doctors accepting gifts, payments, or favors in exchange for favorable or delayed death certifications. This was corrupt. It was also perfectly understandable given the financial pressures of the role, which doesn't make it right but does make it human in the specific way that humans under pressure tend to be human. The more reputable plague doctors resisted this, sometimes at real personal cost. They also often worked to extend their services to patients who genuinely could not pay anything at all. The destitute, the abandoned, the people who had lost their entire household to the epidemic and had nothing left to offer. Medieval cities sometimes made explicit provision for this in the contracts, specifying that the plague doctor was obligated to treat the poor without charge, with the city making up the difference. Whether the city actually did consistently make up the difference is a question the surviving financial records answer with a mixture of yes, sometimes not really, and a silence that speaks volumes. There is something genuinely moving about the plague doctors who stayed, who fulfilled their contracts week after week, who did not flee when the epidemic peaked, who did not renegotiate for better terms when the city was at its most desperate and might have agreed to anything. The ones who simply showed up, dressed in their ridiculous bird costumes, walked into the houses with the red crosses on the doors, and did the work. They were not doing it because the pay was good. The pay was not good. They were not doing it because it was safe. It was not safe. They were doing it because someone had to and they had said they would. Whatever their motivations, ambition, duty, religious conviction, simple inability to imagine doing otherwise, the plague doctors who honored their contracts were performing an act of institutional courage that the medieval world did not have a particularly good vocabulary for recognizing. You were not a hero in the chivalric sense. You were not a saint in the hagiographic sense. You were a contractor, a municipal employee with a waxed robe and a bird mask and a guaranteed salary that the city was, with some regularity, slightly late in paying. But you showed up. You showed up every morning and you strapped on the beak and you walked toward the houses that everyone else was walking away from. And somewhere in the ledgers of a 14th century Italian city, written in the careful Latin of a municipal clerk who had other things to worry about, There is a record of your contract and your salary and the dates of your service. It does not say you were brave. It says you were paid. Sometimes that is the same thing. You open your bag. This is, in the broader context of your career as a medieval plague doctor, a moment that rewards careful psychological preparation. The bag, leather, well-worn, smelling of the same aromatic herbs that fill your beak, because at this point everything you own smells of aromatic herbs, contains the tools and remedies of your trade. It contains, in other words, the sum total of what 14th century medicine has to offer the dying. And if you were hoping that sum total would be impressive or comforting, or in any meaningful sense adequate to the scale of the catastrophe you are operating inside, then this is the moment where that hope takes a quiet, dignified step off a very short cliff. Let's start with the good news, because there is some, and it deserves acknowledgement before we get into the rest of it. Medieval physicians were not simply making things up out of thin air. They were working within a coherent, internally consistent medical tradition that stretched back to ancient Greece and had been developed, refined, transmitted, and elaborated over more than 1,000 years. The works of Hippocrates and Galen, the foundational texts of Western medicine, had been preserved, translated, commented upon, and taught in the medical faculties of European universities since the 12th century. You have read them. You have studied them carefully. You can quote passages from memory in the original Latin and sometimes in the original Greek, depending on how thoroughly your education was funded. You are not an ignorant person. You are an educated person operating within a framework that is wrong in some of its most fundamental assumptions, and that is a very different thing. The framework, specifically, is humoral theory. The idea, originating with Hippocrates and systematized by Galen with the thoroughness of someone who genuinely enjoyed systematizing things, is that the human body contains 4 fundamental fluids or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health is the state of balance among these 4 humors. Disease is the state of imbalance. Different diseases correspond to different imbalances. Too much black bile produces melancholy, too much yellow bile produces fever and irritability, and so on through the combinations and permutations of a system that is internally logical, aesthetically satisfying, and empirically unsupported in any meaningful sense. The humors are also associated with the 4 elements: earth, water, fire, air, with the 4 seasons, with the 4 temperaments, and with various celestial bodies, because medieval medicine was not shy about going big. When plague arrives, the humoral framework attempts to accommodate it. The dominant medieval medical consensus settled on the idea that plague represented a fundamental corruption of the air, the miasma again, now understood in humoral terms as an external force that disrupted the internal balance of the humors, particularly affecting the heart and its associated vital spirits. Treatment, therefore, was aimed at restoring balance, expelling the corrupted material, and supporting the body's own vital forces. In theory, this is not completely unreasonable as a framework. In practice, what it produced in terms of actual remedies is where things get genuinely interesting. The first and most ubiquitous treatment in your bag is theriac, and it deserves a moment of extended attention because it is one of the great pharmaceutical fantasies of the ancient and medieval world. Theriac is a compound medicine, a mixture of dozens of ingredients, sometimes more than 60, combined in specific proportions and prepared according to elaborate protocols. Its ingredients list reads like a shopping list compiled by someone who had access to a spice market, an apothecary, a mythology textbook, and a very open mind. Standard components include viper flesh, yes, actual snake, along with opium, cinnamon, ginger, long pepper, myrrh, various roots and barks and resins, and in some formulations, the dried bodies of specific insects or the powdered remains of particular minerals. The mixture was aged in wine or honey, sometimes for years, before being considered properly potent. Theriac originated in ancient Rome as an antidote to poison. Specifically, it was supposedly developed for King Mithridates of Pontus, who was reportedly so paranoid about being poisoned that he took daily doses of every known toxin in sublethal amounts to build immunity, which is either the most impressive or the most exhausting approach to personal security in recorded history. By the medieval period, theriac had evolved from a poison antidote into a universal medicine, a cure-all of such legendary reputation that major cities maintained official theriac supplies, that the preparation of theriac was a regulated, public, ceremonial event in cities like Venice and that physicians prescribed it for essentially everything including, inevitably, plague. It did not work for plague. It did not work for most things it was prescribed for. The opium content provided genuine pain relief and sedation, which was valuable in the strictly palliative sense of the word. The snake venom component was biologically inert by the time it had been processed, aged, and mixed with everything else, which is fortunate. The dozens of other ingredients contributed flavors, smells, and a certain impressiveness of presentation that reassured patients in the placebo sense. Overall, theriac was a very expensive, very complicated, very ancient way of giving someone opium while making them feel that something elaborate and serious was being done on their behalf. In the context of plague medicine, where nothing you had was actually going to stop the bacterial infection progressing through their lymphatic system, the palliative and psychological functions of theriac were not nothing. But they were also not enough. Beyond theriac, your bag contains a selection of herbal remedies, preparations of plants whose medicinal properties were documented in herbals and materia medica texts going back to ancient sources. Some of these had genuine, if limited, value. Willow bark, which contains salicin, a chemical relative of aspirin, was used for fever reduction, and it actually reduces fever, which is one of those moments where medieval medicine trips forward into correctness. Certain plant preparations had antiparasitic or antimicrobial properties that nobody understood mechanistically but which produced observable effects. The medieval materia medica was not entirely without merit. It was a repository of folk knowledge, accumulated empirical observation, and genuine botanical understanding, filtered through a theoretical framework that could not fully explain why some things worked and therefore could not reliably distinguish the things that worked from the things that merely seemed to work. Your bag also contains instruments for one of the most common and most enduring practices of medieval medicine: bloodletting. The lancet, a small, sharp blade, and the phleem, a multi-bladed instrument for making larger incisions, are standard equipment. Cupping vessels, glass or ceramic cups that are heated to create suction when placed on the skin, drawing blood or fluid to the surface, are part of your kit. Leeches, if you have a fresh supply, which requires the kind of regular logistics that a practitioner in the middle of an epidemic does not always have the organizational bandwidth to maintain. Bloodletting was applied to plague patients with a frequency and confidence that is difficult to contemplate from the other side of germ theory without wincing. The logic was impeccable within the humoral framework. If the body is out of balance, removing some of the excess humor will restore balance. Blood was considered the most likely culprit in feverish, inflammatory conditions, which plague certainly was. Therefore, removing blood from plague patients was a rational therapeutic choice by the standards of the day. In practice, removing blood from someone whose body is already under catastrophic stress from a severe bacterial infection is, and again, the clinical gentleness here is doing a lot of work, not helpful. Patients who were bled were weakened. Patients who were bled extensively were weakened severely. The lancet and the phleem killed some people more quickly than the plague alone would have, which is a sobering thing to consider as you look at them lying in your bag, clean and sharp and ready for use. Here is the quirky tidbit that belongs in this particular corner of the story. One of the recommended plague treatments in several serious medical texts of the period involved the application of a live hen, specifically the hen's plucked rear end, to the bubo. The idea, grounded in a kind of sympathetic or absorptive logic, was that the chicken would draw out the poison from the swollen lymph node through its exposed skin, transferring the corruption from the patient to the bird. The hen would then, ideally, survive this process, which was taken as evidence that the poison had been successfully extracted. If the hen died, this was considered confirmation that the bubo had indeed been poisonous, which was perhaps not the most useful information at that stage of proceedings, but was at least consistent with the theoretical framework. Historians still argue whether the hen treatment was widely practiced or primarily a text-based recommendation that saw limited real-world application. The line between what medieval physicians wrote and what they actually did at the bedside is not always clear, and the hen treatment sits in that ambiguous zone with particular stubbornness. There were dietary recommendations in your treatment arsenal as well. Patients were advised on foods to avoid, those that were considered to increase the harmful humors, and foods to consume that would support recovery. Strengthening broths, easily digestible preparations, foods associated with warmth and dryness to counteract the cold and moist quality attributed to plague corruption. The dietary advice was generally not harmful, and in some cases, keeping patients hydrated, maintaining caloric intake, was actively beneficial. Good nursing care, which medieval physicians tended to prescribe even when they couldn't provide it themselves, saved lives by supporting the body's own immune response in patients who were fighting infections that were survivable with adequate support. The Black Death killed roughly a third to half of Europe's population, which means a substantial number of people survived it. Some of them survived because of basic supportive care, hydration, warmth, rest, that physicians recommended for entirely wrong theoretical reasons. The lance you carried for opening buboes was perhaps your most directly useful tool, in a limited sense. Plague buboes, the swollen lymph nodes packed with bacteria and immune cells, were enormously painful and occasionally did better when lanced and drained, reducing the local pressure and allowing the body's own defenses slightly more room to work. This was agonizing for the patient, performed without anything approaching modern anesthesia beyond perhaps some wine or the opium component of theriac, and the procedure carried its own risks of secondary infection in an environment where nothing was sterile. But it was one of the interventions in your kit that sometimes fractionally helped. The rest of the bag is a mixture of aromatic preparations, more herbs, more resins, incense materials for burning in the sick room, and written materials, notes on individual patients, records of treatments attempted and responses observed, the primitive documentation of a clinical practice that would not be recognized as clinical practice for another several centuries. You write things down. You observe. You note that some patients who receive certain treatments seem to do marginally better than others. You cannot draw valid conclusions from these observations because you have no framework for controlled comparison and no understanding of the bacterial mechanism driving the disease, but you are doing something that looks, from the outside, like the very earliest gestures toward empirical medicine. That is perhaps the most honest assessment of your bag and its contents. It holds the gestures toward treatment, toward symptom management, toward documentation and observation and the attempt to understand. The gestures are not cures. They will not save most of the people in those dark rooms with the crosses on the doors. But they are not nothing, and the people making them were not fools. They were the cutting edge of a tradition doing its level best in conditions that would have tested any medical system. You close the bag. You pick up your stick. You go in. The door swings open and a woman grabs your arm before you are fully inside. Not your stick arm, your actual arm, through the waxed robe, her fingers pressing hard enough that you can feel it through the layers of protective fabric. And she is speaking fast, in the dialect of this particular neighborhood, which is not quite the same as the Latin you trained in or the more formal vernacular of the city's educated classes. And what she is saying, stripped of everything except its essential meaning, is please. Just please. Please help him. Please help her. Please do something. Please be the thing that changes this. You have been doing this job for 6 weeks. You have stood in this exact doorway configuration, the desperate relative, the dark room, the specific quality of indoor air that tells you before you see anything that things are serious, approximately 40 times. You know, with a certainty that sits in your chest like a stone, that you cannot reliably deliver what this woman is asking for. You also know that you will try. You will try with everything in your bag and everything in your training and everything in the tradition of medicine you carry with you into this room, and it will not be enough for a significant number of the people behind that door. And the woman currently gripping your arm will have to find a way to live with that, and so will you. This is bedside manner in the 14th century. It is not gentle. It is not optional. And it will aid you in ways that have nothing to do with the calendar. Your patients are not an abstract category. They are specific people in specific rooms, and the medicine of the medieval period, for all its theoretical wrongness, maintained a strong tradition of attending to the individual patient as a complete person, body, spirit, and circumstances, rather than purely as a disease to be treated. This holistic instinct came partly from the humoral framework, which emphasized that the correct treatment depended on the individual's specific constitutional balance rather than on the disease category alone, and partly from a deep integration of medical and religious practice that shaped how both physician and patient understood illness and recovery. The patient you are most likely to encounter in a plague house is, first and most visibly, a person in extraordinary pain. The buboes, those swollen, taut, hot lymph nodes in the groin or armpit or neck, can reach the size of an egg or larger, and they press against surrounding tissue with an insistence that makes movement agonizing and rest barely more comfortable. Patients describe the pain in terms that their contemporaries recorded with a directness that crosses the centuries without losing any of its force. The fever that accompanies plague is high and relentless, producing delirium in many patients, a state where the person in front of you is present in body but somewhere else entirely in mind, speaking to people who aren't in the room, reacting to things you cannot see, occasionally attempting to get up and walk somewhere that exists only in the landscape of their fever. The delirium presents specific practical challenges for treatment. A patient who does not know where they are cannot cooperate with examination. A patient in the grip of fever-driven agitation cannot be kept still for the application of poultices or the administration of medicines. The family members watching from the walls of the room, those who haven't fled, those who are themselves not yet showing symptoms, sometimes help holding the patient gently, speaking to them in familiar voices that occasionally cut through the delirium in ways that your professional presence cannot. The family's role in medieval medical care was not incidental. It was structural. You were, in most cases, a periodic visitor to a patient who was being cared for continuously by the people around them, and the quality of that continuous care, the maintenance of hydration, the management of fever with cool cloths, the provision of food and warmth and human presence, mattered as much as anything you could deliver in a visit. The social geography of your patients varied considerably across the city, and the variation mattered in ways both medical and deeply human. In the poorer neighborhoods, the densely packed tenements near the markets and the river, where multiple families shared floors and even rooms, plague moved through the population with a speed and completeness that was partly a function of the rat population and the flea burden, and partly a function of the fact that sick people and healthy people could not be separated from each other because there was nowhere to go. Isolation, which you and every other medical authority of the period recommended strongly, required space. Space required money. The people you treated in the poorest neighborhoods were sick partly because of poverty, and your treatment could not address the poverty, and you knew this, and it sat with you. In the wealthier neighborhoods, plague still came. It was, in its democratic indifference to social class, one of the Black Death's more genuinely equalizing features, though wealth still bought you better odds through better nutrition, better housing, and the ability to flee before exposure, but when it came to prosperous households, you encountered a different set of dynamics. The wealthy patient expected more, expected treatment that matched their status, medicines that reflected their ability to pay, and explanations that engaged with their own education and opinions about their condition. Wealthy medieval patients were frequently educated enough to have views about their own humoral constitution and to question your prescriptions based on what they had read or been told by other physicians. Bedside manner in a wealthy household required a different kind of performance. More deferential, more discursive, more willing to engage in extended theoretical discussion at a moment when you had 14 other patients to see before dark. There was also, in the wealthier households, the particular awkwardness of the prognosis conversation. Telling a poor family that their loved one was likely dying was devastating, but it was delivered into a context where death was a constant, familiar, ever-present companion to daily life in a way that modern sensibilities find difficult to fully register. Child mortality, maternal mortality, the ordinary mortality of a world without antibiotics or surgical antisepsis or any of the other things that stand between a modern person and a bacterial infection. All of this meant that death was not the shocking rupture of a normal life that it tends to be for a person living in the 21st century. It was still grief. It was still loss. But it was a kind of grief that medieval people were in some sense equipped for by the texture of their ordinary lives. In a wealthy household, death arrived into a context of greater insulation from ordinary mortality, and the shock was correspondingly more acute. There was also more at stake financially: inheritances, business arrangements, debts, obligations, and the physician delivering a terminal prognosis was stepping into the middle of all of that, with consequences that sometimes circled back to affect the physician directly. The children were the hardest. This requires no elaboration, and yet it must be said because it was true and because you knew it and because the knowing of it was part of the weight you carried around inside the beak mask alongside the dried herbs and the filtered air. Children died of plague at rates that reflected their particular vulnerability. Less robust immune systems, less body mass to sustain the metabolic assault of high fever, less ability to communicate what they were experiencing in ways that helped you assess and respond. You treated children with the same humoral framework you applied to adults, adjusting doses for body size in the way that medieval pharmaceutical tradition specified, and you stood next to small patients in dark rooms and did what you could, and what you could do was not very much. Your bedside manner with children required a specific kind of recalibration. The crow mask, that beak, those glass eyes, that full black-robed figure looming in the doorway, was terrifying to healthy children who encountered it in the street. To a feverish, delirious child in a darkened room, it was something else entirely. Some plague doctors removed parts of the costume when treating children, understanding that the fear response the costume provoked was itself a problem. A child made more distressed by the physician's arrival was a child consuming more of the physiological resources they needed for recovery. Others kept the full costume on, bound by contract, by protocol, or by their own fear of the infection they were there to treat. Historians still argue about how consistently the full protective costume was worn in practice, and the children's cases are one of the points where that argument has real human stakes. You also treated patients who were not dying, and this is worth acknowledging because the mortality statistics of the Black Death, dramatic as they are, can create a mental image of the plague doctor as a figure who exclusively attended the dying. Plague was survivable. The bubonic form, the most common, killed roughly half to two-thirds of those who contracted it. Devastating numbers, but also numbers that imply a substantial population of survivors who needed follow-up care, who needed help rebuilding their strength, who needed someone to assess whether the bubo was resolving or worsening, whether the fever was breaking or returning. Surviving plague patients were frequently left with lasting effects: weakness, joint pain, occasional recurrence of symptoms, and in some cases the psychological aftermath of having survived when everyone around them did not. You saw all of this because you stayed, because your contract required it and your conscience would not have allowed otherwise. You were there for the initial crisis, and you were there for the tentative recovery, and you were there for the grief that came after, when a patient who had survived looked around the room and understood fully, for the first time, who was not there anymore. There is a quirky footnote to the story of patient care during plague epidemics that belongs here. Some medieval cities established what were called lazarettos, isolation hospitals specifically for plague patients, and the plague doctors who worked in these institutions encountered a patient population concentrated in ways that their colleagues doing house visits did not. The Lazaretto of Venice, established on a small island in the lagoon in the early 15th century, and considered the first purpose-built quarantine facility in European history, was a place where plague doctors worked in conditions that were simultaneously better organized and more relentlessly grim than ordinary house calls. Better organized because the facilities were designed for the purpose, with some degree of spatial separation between patients and a supply infrastructure that house visits couldn't match. More relentlessly grim because the concentration of severe cases, the absence of family support, and the sheer volume of suffering in one place created a working environment that no amount of professional preparation fully addressed. Your patients, in all their variety, the desperately poor and the anxiously wealthy, the delirious and the lucid, the survivors and the dying, the children and the elderly, the ones who gripped your arm at the door and the ones who turned their faces to the wall when you arrived, were the reason the job existed. They were also the reason the job was impossible. Not impossible in the sense of pointless. You provided comfort, you documented, you occasionally helped, you maintained the presence of medical authority in spaces where panic and despair might otherwise have been the only available response. But impossible in the sense that the gap between what they needed and what you had was vast, and you stood in that gap every day in your bird mask and your waxed robe with your bag of theriac and bloodletting equipment and live poultry recommendations, and you tried. The woman at the door has let go of your arm. She steps back and lets you into the room, and you follow the sounds of labored breathing to the corner where the patient lies, and you set down your bag and you raise your stick and you begin the examination that both of you know may not change anything at all. You begin it anyway. That is the whole of the job, really. You begin it anyway. Somewhere around the third week of the epidemic, the mood of the city turns. You feel it before you can articulate it. A shift in the quality of the silence when you walk through the streets, a change in the way people look at you that is different from the usual mixture of fear and relief your costume produces. The fear is still there, but the relief is draining out of it, replaced by something harder and less comfortable, something that has been building in the population the way pressure builds behind a dam, quietly and invisibly until it isn't quiet or invisible anymore. The city is looking for someone to blame, and you, the person who has been walking into plague houses every day, the person most visibly associated with the disease, the person in the crow mask, are starting to look less like a protector and more like a symbol, and not a comforting one. Welcome to the blame game, which is one of the oldest human responses to catastrophe, and which the medieval world played with a creativity and a viciousness that deserves serious attention. The need to assign cause to disaster is not a medieval pathology. It is a human one. When something terrible happens at the scale of the Black Death, when a third to half of the population of an entire continent dies within a few years, when the dying is random enough to feel deliberate but patterned enough to invite explanation, when the institutions of the church and the state and the medical profession demonstrably cannot stop it, the psychological pressure toward explanation becomes enormous. Random, inexplicable catastrophe is, in some deep cognitive sense, harder to bear than catastrophe with a cause. Cause implies an agent. An agent implies the possibility of intervention. If you can find who or what is responsible, you can, in theory, do something about it. You can punish. You can expel. You can burn. You can perform the ritual of accountability that transforms helplessness into action, even when the action accomplishes nothing useful. The medieval world had several explanatory frameworks available, and it deployed all of them simultaneously with an energy that reflected the scale of the crisis. The theological explanation, that the plague was God's punishment for human sin, was the most widely available and the most socially acceptable. It had the advantage of being unfalsifiable, of placing causation in a domain where no human intervention could be expected to succeed, and of providing a clear prescription for response: prayer, penitence, procession, the public performance of contrition. Churches were packed. Flagellant movements, groups of penitents who traveled between cities publicly whipping themselves as demonstrations of penance, emerged across Europe, drawing crowds and spreading both their message and, incidentally, the plague itself as they moved from town to town. The flagellants were earnest, terrifying, medically counterproductive, and genuinely moving as an expression of human desperation in the face of the incomprehensible. The astrological explanation, that the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius in 1345 had corrupted the air and initiated the epidemic, was the official position of the medical faculty at the University of Paris, which had been consulted by the French king for an authoritative explanation of the catastrophe. This explanation was sophisticated, internally consistent, and the product of some of the best-educated minds in Europe. It was also, in the practical sense, useless as a guide to action. You cannot arrest a planetary conjunction. You cannot put Saturn on trial. The astrological explanation, elegant as it was within its own framework, did not give the population a target, which meant that other explanatory frameworks were left to fill that gap. The targets that medieval European populations settled on were multiple, and the history of plague-era persecution is one of the darkest threads running through an already dark period. Jewish communities across Europe were accused of poisoning wells, a charge that was geographically inconsistent, logically incoherent, and completely without evidentiary basis, none of which reduced its lethal effectiveness. Pogroms spread ahead of and alongside the plague itself, with Jewish communities in cities across Germany, France, Switzerland, and Spain massacred by populations that had convinced themselves they had identified both the cause of their suffering and the appropriate response. Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls explicitly stating that the accusations were false and that Jews were dying of plague at similar rates to Christians, which was true, and ordering that they be protected. The bulls were largely ignored. Foreigners were suspected. Travelers were feared. The stranger who had arrived from somewhere else, from the direction the plague seemed to be coming from, was a natural candidate for suspicion in communities that were terrified and looking for a mechanism. This generalized xenophobia had the ironic effect of sometimes reducing the very trade and movement that, had plague doctors understood bacterial transmission, they would have recognized as genuinely relevant to the epidemic's spread. For the wrong reasons, the right-ish intuition. And then there were the plague doctors themselves. Your position in this landscape of blame was peculiar and uncomfortable in ways that evolved as the epidemic continued. In the early stages of an outbreak, your arrival was welcomed. You were the professional, the trained person, the symbol of institutional response. Families opened their doors. Municipal authorities pointed to your contract as evidence that they were doing something. You walked through neighborhoods and people made way, and while the fear in their eyes was real, so was the relief. As weeks became months and the death toll rose and your treatments demonstrably failed to produce recoveries at any rate that felt proportionate to the effort, the emotional equation began to shift. You kept arriving. People kept dying. The most primitive form of human pattern recognition, the correlation between your presence and the deaths that followed, began to seed itself in the minds of the most desperate and the most frightened. You came and people died. You kept coming and more people died. The fact that people were dying before you arrived, and would have continued dying at the same rate without you, was the kind of nuanced epidemiological point that did not survive contact with grief. There were accusations. In several documented historical cases, plague doctors were accused by community members of deliberately spreading the disease, of carrying infection from house to house on purpose, either for payment from some shadowy external enemy or simply out of malice. The specific accusation varied by location and circumstance, but the underlying logic was consistent. You were the one moving freely through the infected areas while others stayed home, and things kept getting worse. And the conjunction of those two facts was enough for some people to construct a narrative of agency and intent where none existed. Historians still argue about how widespread and serious these accusations became in practice, whether they resulted in significant violence against plague doctors, or whether they remained primarily at the level of rumor and social hostility. The documented cases of actual violence against plague doctors are not numerous, but the social atmosphere of suspicion they operated in was real enough to feature in contemporary accounts and to shape the professional experience of plague medicine in measurable ways. The quarantine enforcement role made things considerably worse. Cities that implemented quarantine measures, restricting movement, closing city gates to travelers from infected areas, confining the sick and their households, assigned plague doctors a central role in that enforcement apparatus. You were the person who confirmed plague diagnoses. You were the person whose assessment triggered the sealing of a household, the nailing shut or locking of doors, the posting of guards, the imposition of the regime that meant a family could not leave, could not receive visitors, could not conduct business or buy food independently but had to rely on whatever provisions the city arranged to have delivered. Your diagnosis was the key that locked the door. You became, in the minds of the people you were supposed to be helping, also the instrument of their confinement. This was, to put it mildly, a complicating factor in the therapeutic relationship. The quarantine system was genuinely necessary from a public health perspective. The instinct that restricting movement reduced spread was correct, even if the mechanism was understood in miasmatic rather than epidemiological terms. But it was experienced by those subjected to it as punishment, as abandonment, as the city's official declaration that the people inside the sealed house were acceptable losses. The plague doctor who arrived to confirm the diagnosis and whose assessment set the quarantine machinery in motion was the face of that system, the representative of institutional authority at its most intimate and most coercive. People who had initially welcomed you began to view your arrival with something approaching dread, not because of what you personally intended, but because of what your presence signified and what it set in motion. There is a specific, documented, slightly darkly comic category of problem that arose from this dynamic. People began hiding the sick. Families who understood that a confirmed plague diagnosis would seal their household, cutting off their income, their freedom of movement, their ability to buy food, had a powerful practical incentive to conceal symptoms and avoid summoning the plague doctor until the situation became undeniable. This meant that by the time you were actually called, the disease had often progressed further than it would have if you had been summoned earlier, which reduced your already limited ability to intervene effectively, which contributed to the mortality rate, which intensified the fear and suspicion that had led to the concealment in the first place. Medieval public health was, in this way, working against itself through the predictable mechanisms of human self-interest interacting with punitive institutional response. The religious dimension of blame also circled back to affect you professionally. Some communities, particularly in areas where plague doctors were perceived as insufficiently pious, or where medical practice was seen as competing with divine providence, challenged the legitimacy of seeking medical treatment at all. If the plague was God's punishment for sin, was it not presumptuous to seek a medical remedy rather than a spiritual one? Should the sick not pray and confess rather than summon the man with the bird mask? Priests and plague doctors sometimes found themselves in implicit or explicit competition for the attention of the dying, and the competition was not always resolved in your favor. There were households where you were not summoned because the family had decided that the matter was in God's hands and no business of yours, and you walked past those houses and heard what was happening inside and could do nothing. The scapegoating extended to the profession broadly, to the entire project of secular medicine in the face of a catastrophe that secular medicine demonstrably could not address. If the physicians could not cure the plague, what exactly were they for? This question, sharp and fair and difficult to answer honestly, was asked in homes and taverns and churches across epidemic Europe, and it echoed in places where you could hear it. It did not make the work easier. It did not make the getting up in the morning easier, or the strapping on of the beak mask easier, or the walking toward the house with the cross easier. What it did, over time, was harden something in you. Not into bitterness, exactly, though bitterness would have been understandable and human. More into a kind of settled determination, the stubbornness of a person who has been told repeatedly that what they are doing is pointless and has decided, for reasons that are no longer entirely rational, to keep doing it anyway. The job still needed doing. Someone still had to do it. The blame could land where it wanted. You had a full bag, an empty morning, and 14 more houses to visit before dark. You adjust the beak. You pick up the stick. You walk toward the shouting, not away from it. The order comes down on a Tuesday. You know it's Tuesday because the market that normally fills the square outside your designated lodgings, the fish stalls and the bread sellers and the woman who always has the very good hard cheese that you have been using as one of your primary sources of comfort since this epidemic began, has been shut down by municipal decree, and the absence of it has a Tuesday-shaped quality that you feel in your stomach before you read the posted notice. The notice, written in the careful Latin of civic officialdom and nailed to a wooden post at the corner of the main street, informs the residents of this district that, in response to the continuing epidemic and in accordance with the Health Board's latest deliberations, movement within and between neighborhoods will be restricted. Households in which plague has been confirmed will be sealed. The gates of the city will be closed to incoming traffic from specified regions. Designated officials, including the plague doctors, will be responsible for monitoring compliance. You are, in other words, now also a quarantine enforcer. Add it to the list. The history of quarantine is one of the more genuinely fascinating threads in the entire history of public health, and you are living inside its earliest serious institutional expression. The word itself, quarantine, comes from the Italian quarantina, meaning 40 days, derived from the period of isolation that the city of Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, formally imposed on ships arriving from plague-affected regions in 1377. 30 days was tried first, a Trentino, but 40 days was felt to be more thorough, possibly because 40 had deep biblical resonance as a period of trial and purification, and possibly because 30 days sometimes wasn't quite enough to be certain that a ship's crew was genuinely healthy. The number 40 was where sacred and practical converged, and quarantine as a formal institution was born from that convergence. By the time you are practicing, the quarantine concept has spread from maritime contexts into the internal management of epidemic cities, and you are part of the machinery that implements it. This means several things simultaneously, none of which is particularly comfortable. It means you are responsible for inspecting households to confirm or deny plague presence, with the knowledge that your confirmation triggers confinement. It means you are responsible for monitoring the compliance of households that have been sealed, checking that the doors are still sealed, that people are not slipping in and out through windows or back passages, that the guards posted to enforce the confinement are doing their jobs and have not been bribed, persuaded, or simply walked away from because the boredom and the danger of standing outside a plague house for days at a time are equally effective at eroding professional commitment. And it means you are, once again, the visible face of a system that is inflicting real hardship on real people in the name of a public health principle that they did not ask to be explained to them. The experience of quarantine from the inside, from the perspective of the people being confined, was, by all surviving accounts, genuinely terrible. This is not to say it was unjustified. Restricting the movement of infected individuals and their close contacts was, even with the wrong theoretical justification, a sound public health practice, and the cities that implemented it most rigorously did show, over time and multiple epidemic waves, measurably better outcomes than those that didn't. The data, such as it was in the 14th and 15th centuries, supported the policy. The data did not, however, make the experience of the policy any less harrowing for the people inside the sealed doors. Imagine, and this is the particular invitation of the second-person voice, the reason we do this, imagine being sealed inside your home. Not your choice. Not a voluntary withdrawal from social contact made comfortable by food delivery apps and streaming entertainment and the knowledge that the world outside will still be there when you emerge. Imagine a door being sealed from the outside. Imagine a guard posted at the street end of your alley with instructions to turn you back if you try to leave. Imagine that your income depended on your ability to leave the house and work, that most of the economic activities available to 14th century urban residents required physical presence in a marketplace or workshop or someone else's home, and that the quarantine that was theoretically protecting the city was practically destroying your ability to feed your family during the weeks it remained in effect. Food provision for quarantined households was theoretically the city's responsibility. Most quarantine protocols included some provision for supplying confined households with basic necessities, but the implementation of this theoretical responsibility was inconsistent, underfunded, and subject to the same administrative pressures and supply chain disruptions that afflicted every other aspect of epidemic management. Households that were sealed sometimes waited days for promised food deliveries that didn't arrive on schedule, or arrived in quantities insufficient for the number of people inside, or arrived and were distributed by methods that created their own problems, lowering baskets from windows on ropes, passing goods through slots in doors, arrangements that were logistically creative and humanly demeaning in equal measure. People broke quarantine. Of course they did. They broke it for the most comprehensible reasons imaginable, because they were hungry, because they needed medicine for a family member who was sick with something other than plague, because they needed to check on an elderly parent in another part of the city, because the psychological pressure of confinement in a small space with sick and dying family members exceeded what they could sustain. Some broke quarantine in desperation and exposed new households to infection, which was exactly the outcome the quarantine was designed to prevent. Some broke quarantine and went home safely and never spread anything to anyone, and their violations were never detected, and history did not record their names. The epidemiological impact of individual quarantine breaks was real and variable and essentially impossible to measure precisely, which meant that authorities responded to all violations with the same institutional seriousness regardless of actual risk, which meant the enforcement response was often disproportionate to the individual case, which intensified the resentment. Your role in enforcement required you to make assessments. Not just medical assessments, whether this cough was plague or not plague, whether this swelling was a bubo or a more ordinary lymph node inflammation, but quasi-judicial assessments about compliance, about intent, about whether a family that had been found with a household member outside the sealed perimeter had broken quarantine deliberately or through desperation or through a genuine misunderstanding of the terms. You had no training for this. Nothing in Galen or Hippocrates addressed the adjudication of quarantine violations. You were improvising, and you were doing it while wearing a bird mask, which did not enhance the dignity or fairness of the proceedings. There is a particular document from 15th century Venice, not the 14th, slightly later, but the institutional logic had been established by the time you were working, describing a plague doctor's report on a quarantine violation case involving a woman who had left her sealed household to buy bread because the delivery promised by the city had not arrived for 3 days. The report notes the violation, notes the circumstances, and recommends a degree of leniency on the grounds that the failure of provision was the city's failure before it was hers. It is a small document. It is not famous, but it represents something genuine and important. A plague doctor using whatever institutional authority they possessed to advocate, within a punitive system, for a reasonable human being who had made a reasonable human decision under unreasonable pressure. Historians still argue about how representative such interventions were, or whether they were exceptional enough to have been worth recording precisely because they were unusual. The cities themselves were, in some quarters, less restrained in their enforcement. Guards who caught people breaking quarantine could impose immediate physical restraint. Fines were levied. In extreme cases, during the worst peaks of epidemic panic, execution was threatened as a penalty for quarantine violation. The logic being that an individual who broke quarantine and spread the disease was, functionally, killing their neighbors, which was a crime that the medieval legal imagination could map onto existing categories of criminal homicide. Whether such sentences were actually carried out, and with what frequency, is a matter of historical debate. The threat was real. The deterrent effect was, given the rates of quarantine violation recorded in municipal documents, limited. The travelers were a separate problem. City gates were closed, officially, to people coming from plague-affected regions, but the medieval city gate was not an airtight seal. Trade routes that fed the city with food and goods passed through those gates, and the merchants and drivers and porters who moved those goods could not be simply stopped without stopping the supply chains that kept the city fed. Exceptions were made, inspections were conducted. Travelers were questioned about their origins and their health in processes that had no reliable diagnostic basis whatsoever. Asking someone whether they felt well and looking at their face was not an effective plague screening protocol, especially given that bubonic plague has an incubation period of several days during which a person can be infected and infectious without showing obvious symptoms. The gates were a gesture toward control that was partially effective at best and completely ineffective at worst. You were sometimes posted at the gates, standing in your full costume at the entrance to the city, examining travelers and making admission decisions that you were not equipped to make reliably but which you made anyway because someone had to and you were the designated medical authority on duty. The line of travelers waiting to enter stretched back along the road in both directions. Some of them had come long distances. Some had sick family members with them. Some were clearly healthy. Some had the particular careful stillness of people who knew they were not entirely healthy and were hoping that the person in the bird mask would not notice. You noticed. You sent some of them away. You admitted others. You were wrong in both directions, certainly statistically, inevitably, and you could not know in which direction the errors fell until days later when the disease's incubation period expired and the outcome announced itself. The quarantine system, for all its cruelties and inefficiencies, was doing something genuinely important at the level of the epidemic even when it felt most hopeless at the level of the individual. The cities that maintained the most consistent quarantine regimes, Venice and the other major Italian maritime cities, which had both the institutional capacity and the accumulated experience of multiple epidemic waves to draw on, developed over time the most sophisticated public health infrastructure in Europe, the foundations of systems that would persist and develop and eventually contribute to the institutional framework of modern epidemiology. The misery of the individual quarantine experience was, in the broadest possible historical view, the price paid for institutional learning that saved lives not in the epidemic it was first applied to but in the ones that came after. This is cold comfort if you are the person inside the sealed door. It is also cold comfort if you are the person in the bird mask standing outside it, monitoring compliance, recording violations, and trying to do something useful in a situation that was designed more for containment than for care. Your medical training is being used, in the quarantine role, primarily as a legitimizing credential for functions that were essentially administrative and coercive. You are the medical face of a public health apparatus, and the face is doing work that the medicine cannot. Your presence signals expertise. Your assessment carries institutional authority. The decisions you make are based on observation and experience and the particular kind of judgment that develops in a person who has spent weeks walking through an epidemic city with glass eyes and a beak full of herbs, and they are better than no assessment at all, and they are not nearly good enough, and you make them anyway because the morning is not getting any longer and the line at the gate is not getting any shorter. You make them anyway. You write them down. You stamp them with whatever seal the city has provided you to make your assessments official. And then you go back into the city, and you do the rest of the day's work, and the gates close behind you. There is a man outside the third house on your morning route who got there before you. You can tell this because he is already inside. His bag is on the step, smaller than yours and more ostentatiously equipped with bright brass fittings that catch the early light in the way that things purchased primarily for appearance rather than function tend to do. And you can hear his voice through the closed door, already explaining something in the loud, confident register of a person who has recently discovered that confidence is more convincing than competence, at least in the short term. He is, based on the bag and the tone and the timing, almost certainly a barber surgeon. He got there first. He is probably bleeding someone as you stand on the step reading the situation, and the family is probably grateful for his presence in the way that people who have been waiting in fear and uncertainty are grateful for anyone who arrives with an air of purpose and a brass-fitted bag. You stand on the step for a moment and feel something that is technically professional irritation, but which is also, if you are being honest with yourself, the slightly personal sting of arriving second. The medical landscape of medieval Europe was not the clean, hierarchically organized system that modern people, accustomed to licensing boards and professional certification and the general concept that medicine is practiced by doctors, might assume. It was instead a complicated, contested, overlapping ecosystem of practitioners at multiple levels of training, legitimacy, and effectiveness, all competing for the business of the sick in a market that was, during epidemic periods, both enormous in scale and impossible to serve adequately. You were trained. You had university credentials. You had Galen and Hippocrates and the humoral framework and a municipal contract and a costume that marked you as the official, designated, city-approved plague doctor. You also had, in practical terms, treatments that didn't work very well. And so did everyone else, which meant the competitive field was more level than your credentials would suggest. And the man with the brass-fitted bag was not entirely without a claim on this patient's attention. The barber surgeons were the most direct competitors you encountered at the bedside, and they deserve both respect and a raised eyebrow in roughly equal measure. The barber surgeon tradition, practitioners who combined the cutting of hair with the performance of surgical procedures, united by the common skill set of working confidently with sharp implements, was one of the most prevalent forms of medical practice in medieval Europe, numerically speaking. They were more numerous than university-trained physicians, often more accessible to poorer patients, and frequently more willing to engage with the physical, hands-on work of treatment that the learned physicians, shaped by a tradition that valued theory over manual labor, sometimes considered beneath them. Barber surgeons bled patients, lanced buboes, extracted teeth, set broken bones, sutured wounds, and performed a range of procedures that the university-trained physician often prescribed but did not personally execute. The intellectual labor of diagnosis and treatment planning was considered distinct from and superior to the manual labor of actual surgical intervention. This distinction was partly a matter of social class, partly a matter of professional tradition, and partly a matter of practical history. Surgeons had long been considered a separate and lesser craft from medicine proper, a division that survived in vestigial form in the separation of the Royal Colleges of Physicians and Surgeons in England for centuries after this period. During a plague epidemic, when the most urgent practical interventions were physical ones, lancing the buboes, managing fever, providing direct physical care, the barber surgeon's willingness to get their hands involved was not a minor advantage. The barber surgeon you are currently being beaten to patience by had, you suspect, a better bedside manner than you do. This is not a comfortable thought, but it is probably accurate. The full plague doctor costume, the beak, the glass eyes, the waxed robe, was professionally necessary and practically useful and also, from the patient's perspective, profoundly dehumanizing. You were a shape, a symbol, a figure from the visual vocabulary of catastrophe. The barber surgeon arrived in ordinary clothes with a friendly face and a direct manner and the kind of physical confidence that comes from spending years working on people with their eyes open, and the patients responded to that. The terrified family in the dark room responded to that. The human face and the human voice and the hand that touched rather than prodded with a stick. These things mattered in ways that your theoretical superiority did not always successfully counteract. Your other competitors were the apothecaries, and they occupied a different but equally complicated position in the medical hierarchy. The apothecary was the pharmacist, the preparer and dispenser of medicines, and in a world where medicine was primarily delivered through substances consumed, applied, or inhaled rather than through surgical procedures, the apothecary's role was central. They stocked the theriac and the herbal preparations and the aromatic compounds for fumigation and the dozens of other remedies that both you and the barber surgeon prescribed. During epidemic periods, apothecaries were overwhelmed. Demand for medicinal substances of all kinds exploded as the population sought anything that might help or protect or at least produce the feeling that something active was being done against the disease. The apothecaries who were honest, and many were, operating within a tradition of pharmaceutical knowledge that was genuinely sophisticated in its understanding of plant-based medicines, were valuable partners in the epidemic response. They knew their materials. They could advise on preparation and dosage. They maintained supply chains for medicinal substances that required sourcing from considerable distances. The spice trade and the medicinal trade were deeply intertwined in the medieval economy, and the apothecary stood at that intersection with a practical expertise that complemented your theoretical training. The apothecaries who were less honest were a different matter. Epidemic fear created a market for protection as well as treatment, and the line between legitimate medicine and exploitative quackery was, in 14th century terms, much less clearly defined than it is today. Preparations sold as preventatives against plague, rings of aromatic herbs, amulets containing specific substances, fumigation compounds that promised to purify the air, were sold by apothecaries ranging from the genuinely well-intentioned to the nakedly opportunistic. The genuinely well-intentioned ones were still selling products that didn't work as advertised. The nakedly opportunistic ones were selling products that were sometimes actively harmful, or were simply ordinary substances at plague premium prices, or were theatrical preparations designed to impress rather than treat. You encountered their work regularly at the bedsides of patients who had already tried the apothecary's preventative before your arrival, which meant patients who were sick despite having followed the preventative protocol and were now experiencing the particular demoralization of a failed magical solution on top of everything else. The demoralization mattered medically. Medieval medicine was well aware of the connection between the patient's psychological state and their physical recovery. Galen had written extensively about the importance of hope in convalescence, and a patient who had already tried the special preparation from the apothecary and was sick anyway was a patient whose hopefulness had been damaged before you arrived. Restoring it was part of your job, and it was harder when you had to work around the debris of the previous intervention. Beyond the barber surgeons and apothecaries, you competed with a broader category of practitioners that the Latin sources call empirici, practitioners without formal training who practiced based on experience, observation, traditional knowledge, or simple invention. Folk healers, wise women, herbalists working from inherited tradition rather than written texts, cunning men and women who combined plant knowledge with ritual practice in ways that blurred the line between medicine and magic in the medieval conceptual framework, and which, in the modern framework, sits somewhere between genuine empirical knowledge, placebo effect, and the occasional harmful recommendation. These practitioners served populations that were geographically or economically beyond the reach of formal medical practice, and they served them with varying degrees of effectiveness. And they were your competitors in the sense that they offered an alternative to your services even if they occupied a different social stratum. The relationship between learned medicine and folk practice was complicated and not entirely hostile. Physicians sometimes drew on folk knowledge. The empirical observations of people who had spent generations working with plants and bodies were not valueless just because they lacked theoretical grounding. And a physician who was paying attention could learn things from a skilled herbalist that the university texts hadn't covered. The knowledge flowed in both directions, messily and without acknowledgement in either direction, because the professional politics of the situation made explicit mutual respect difficult. You did not officially validate the folk practitioner, but you noticed when something they recommended had observable effects, and you filed the observation somewhere in the back of your mind where useful things lived. There was also, during plague epidemics, a specific and particularly problematic category of competition from outright frauds. The scale of the crisis and the desperation of the population created ideal conditions for charlatans, traveling practitioners who arrived in epidemic areas with dramatic presentations, confident claims, and remedies that ranged from useless to dangerous. Some were spectacularly theatrical. Public demonstrations of their treatments, testimonials from people they claimed to have cured, elaborate preparations sold at high prices on the basis of secret knowledge allegedly acquired from ancient or exotic sources. The theatrical charlatan was a recognized figure in medieval culture, satirized in literature and complained about in official documents, and the plague epidemic brought them out in numbers proportional to the opportunity. Here is the quirky detail that lives in this corner of the story. Some of the most committed anti-charlatan campaigners of the plague era were the municipal authorities who had contracted the plague doctors, and their motivation was not purely patient welfare. It was also straightforwardly financial. If a traveling charlatan was convincing plague victims' families to spend their money on a dramatic but fraudulent cure, that was money not being spent on services provided by the contracted plague doctors, which was money leaving the system that the municipality had invested in building. The campaign against medical fraud in epidemic cities was driven by a mixture of genuine public health concern and economic protectionism that the official documents do not always clearly distinguish between. Historians still argue about the relative weight of these motivations and whether the regulatory response to medical fraud during plague epidemics represented a meaningful step toward patient protection or primarily an exercise in professional guild politics wearing the costume of public health. The man with the brass-fitted bag is coming out of the house as you are going in, and you pass in the doorway and he nods at you, not unfriendly, the nod of a working person who has done their portion of a shared task. And you nod back through your beak mask, which is, you are aware, a somewhat undignified way to exchange professional courtesies. He has bled the patient. You can tell from the basin that a family member is carrying toward the door. The patient is a middle-aged man who looks up at you with eyes that are tired and feverish and accustomed to visitors they did not choose. You set down your bag. You assess the situation. You make your own determination about what can be done, overlapping with what has been done, adding what you can add from the theoretical framework that your training provides and the brass-fitted bags training did not. You are neither better nor worse than the man who just left, in any way that the patient lying on the pallet would be able to meaningfully measure. You are different. You bring different things. Together, between you are covering something that neither of you could cover alone. This is, you think, lifting your stick, beginning the examination, speaking in your most reassuring professional register through the beak that muffles your voice slightly so everything sounds like a calm rumble emanating from a bird-shaped void. Not the worst arrangement the sick could have. Not the best either, but not the worst. You survive. This is not guaranteed, and you should feel the full weight of that contingency before you let yourself feel anything like relief. A meaningful number of your real-life counterparts did not survive. Plague doctors who contracted the disease from the patients they treated, who succumbed despite the waxed robes and the lavender beaks and the careful stick-mediated examinations that were supposed to keep them at a safe remove from the infection. The protective equipment worked fractionally and inconsistently, in the way that well-intentioned precautions built on incorrect theoretical foundations tend to work, better than nothing, worse than necessary, and wholly unable to account for the flea that crawled unnoticed beneath the hem of the robe on a warm afternoon in the 4th week of the epidemic and made its own decision about the matter. But you are here. The epidemic has not ended. The Black Death did not end cleanly, did not arrive at a finish line and stop, but rather receded and returned in waves over decades, reshaping European society with each recurrence. But this particular wave has peaked and is pulling back, the way terrible things sometimes do, exhausting themselves against the resistance of the people who simply refused to stop surviving. The death toll in your city was, by any honest accounting, catastrophic. You know exactly how catastrophic because you counted. You wrote it down. You were there for the counting in a way that almost nobody else was, walking through neighborhoods when the streets were quiet in the wrong way, making your notes in the careful hand of someone who understood that the numbers, however inadequate as a representation of what had actually happened, were the only durable record that would remain. Those numbers, and the records that surrounded them, turn out to be more important than anyone quite realized at the time. The legacy of the medieval plague doctor is not the theriac, which didn't work. It is not the humoral framework, which was wrong. It is not the hen applied to the bubo, which was wrong in a more entertaining way. The legacy is the institutional infrastructure that plague medicine forced into existence, the contracts, the records, the quarantine systems, the designated facilities, the public health boards that formed in response to epidemic crisis and then, crucially, did not entirely dissolve when the crisis receded. Cities that had built administrative machinery to manage the Black Death found themselves in possession of institutional capacity that could be applied to the next epidemic, and the one after that, and the gradual accumulation of that capacity, imperfect, contested, often corrupt, always underfunded, is the direct ancestor of modern public health. The lazaretto system deserves specific acknowledgement in this accounting. The plague islands established by Venice and imitated by other maritime cities, those facilities for isolating the sick and the suspected sick, were the first purpose-built public health infrastructure in European history. They were staffed, in part, by plague doctors. They were funded by municipal authorities. They operated according to protocols that were written down and revised after each epidemic on the basis of what had seemed to work and what had seemed not to work. A primitive but recognizable form of evidence-based institutional learning. The lazarettos evolved over the 15th and 16th centuries from emergency measures into permanent institutions, staffed year-round, maintained in readiness for the next outbreak. This is the institutional logic of public health departments. This is the germ, in the non-bacterial sense, of the World Health Organization. The line from the Venetian lazaretto to the modern global health infrastructure is not straight, and it passes through centuries of development that had nothing to do with plague doctors specifically. But it begins here, in these islands in the lagoon, staffed by people in crowbeak masks who were wrong about almost everything and right about enough. The quarantine system similarly outlasted the theoretical framework that had produced it. Cities that had implemented 40-day isolation periods for arriving ships and travelers had done so on miasmatic grounds, preventing the bad air from infected regions from entering the city. When germ theory eventually arrived in the 19th century and provided a correct explanation for how infectious disease spread, the quarantine system was already there, already institutionalized, already written into the administrative DNA of port cities across Europe. The mechanism needed updating. The instrument was already built. There is something quietly remarkable about that. A tool constructed for the wrong reasons in the service of a wrong theory that turns out to be the right shape for the right theory when the right theory finally arrives centuries later. The record-keeping legacy is perhaps the most direct line from medieval plague medicine to modern practice. The plague doctors who documented deaths, recorded symptoms, noted the geographic pattern of cases, and reported to municipal health boards were performing something that looks, from the far side of the intervening centuries, recognizably like epidemiological surveillance. They had no concept of germ theory, no understanding of the actual mechanism of transmission, no statistical framework for analyzing the patterns they were observing. But they were observing patterns. They were writing them down. They were communicating them to authorities who were making policy decisions on the basis of that information. The reports were wrong in their interpretations and invaluable in their data, which is a ratio that epidemiology has not entirely moved beyond even now. Some of the plague doctors wrote more than reports. They wrote treatises, practical guides to plague medicine that were copied and distributed and read by other practitioners in other cities facing their own outbreaks. The plague treatise was a distinct literary genre in the 14th and 15th centuries, and while its medical advice was rooted in the humoral and miasmatic framework that we now know to be incorrect, the best of these treatises also contained observational content of genuine value, descriptions of symptom progression, notes on which interventions seemed to correlate with better outcomes, discussions of the demographics of mortality that were, in their rough way, the ancestors of modern clinical documentation. Historians still argue about the extent to which these treatises actually changed practice, as opposed to simply codifying existing practice in a form that circulated among a literate professional audience. The answer is probably both, in proportions that varied by region and by individual physician. There is a quirky and slightly wonderful footnote to the legacy of plague medicine that deserves its place in this accounting. The beaked mask, that most iconic element of the plague doctor's visual identity, did not originate in the 14th century. The full beaked costume, the hat, the robe, the glass-eyed beak, appears in its most elaborate and well-documented form in the work of a 17th-century French physician named Charles Delorme, who designed or refined the costume for use during outbreaks in the early 1600s. The 14th-century plague doctors almost certainly wore protective clothing of some kind, and beak-shaped nose coverings containing aromatic herbs are described in sources from the period, but the fully developed visual icon that everyone pictures when they think of a plague doctor may be a later elaboration, a 17th-century refinement of a 14th-century practice, which then got retroactively projected backward in the historical imagination to represent the entire plague doctor tradition. It is one of history's more successful visual simplifications, and it produced an image so compelling that it has survived into Halloween costumes and Venetian carnival masks and the aesthetic vocabulary of an entire subculture. Delorme, whoever he was and however much he deserves the credit, accidentally created one of the most enduring icons in medical history. The medical profession that emerged from the plague era was different from the one that had entered it, in ways that were not always comfortable to acknowledge from inside the profession. The plague had exposed, with brutal clarity, the limits of learned medicine, the gap between the theoretical sophistication of the humoral framework and its practical uselessness against the specific emergency of a bacterial epidemic. This exposure did not immediately produce a scientific revolution. The humoral framework survived for centuries, revised and defended and adapted but not abandoned until evidence accumulated sufficiently to make continued defense intellectually untenable. But the plague planted seeds of empirical skepticism that grew slowly in the subsequent centuries. The observation that learned physicians had not done better than folk practitioners in many cases, that the most theoretically sophisticated treatments had not produced better outcomes than simple supportive care, that the framework could not explain why some people survived and others did not despite similar treatment, began to create, in the minds of the more thoughtful physicians of subsequent generations, a productive unease with received wisdom. That unease, the willingness to question the inherited framework in the light of observed outcomes, is the intellectual ancestor of the scientific method as applied to medicine. It took centuries to develop into something recognizable as modern evidence-based practice. It required the microscope and the germ theory and the randomized controlled trial and 100 other developments that had nothing specifically to do with plague doctors. But the questioning began somewhere, and the Black Death's demonstration that the best medicine of the age was insufficient was one of the places it began. You think about all of this, not with the clarity of someone who can see across the centuries, but with the particular thoughtfulness of someone who has been walking through an epidemic city for months, observing everything, writing it down, surviving, as you make your way through the quieter streets of a city that is beginning, slowly and tentatively, to return to something resembling itself. The market is open again. Not full, the gaps in the stalls, the absences that correspond to people who are not there to run them anymore, are visible and will remain visible for a long time. But open. The woman with the hard cheese is back, which you take as a specific and personal indicator of recovery. You buy some. You deserve it. You have earned cheese through means that most cheese earners throughout history have not had to contemplate. The beak mask is off, for the moment. You are carrying it under your arm, the glass eyes catching the morning light, the beak pointing forward in its perpetual expression of slightly aggressive concern. Children stare at it from a safe distance. An older child, bolder than the others, asks you what it is. You tell them it is your work equipment. They consider this information with the particular seriousness of children confronted with an answer that raises more questions than it resolves, and then they run off, and you watch them go with something that takes a moment to identify as something adjacent to hope. The job was terrible. The pay was inadequate. The medicine was wrong. The costume was uncomfortable. The smell was indescribable. The patients were dying faster than you could reach them. The community blamed you for things you didn't cause. The quarantine enforcement made you an instrument of a system that hurt people. And the competition from barber surgeons and apothecaries and outright frauds was a constant professional indignity on top of everything else. And yet, you showed up. Every morning you showed up. You strapped on the beak and picked up the stick and walked toward the crosses on the doors, and you wrote down what you saw, and you tried what you had, and you stayed when you could have fled, and you documented in your careful records a crisis that the city needed documented so that it could be understood, even if the full understanding would require centuries and a scientific revolution and the invention of the microscope. Your piece of the understanding was small. It was partial. It was entangled with theories that were wrong and practices that were ineffective and a professional framework that the future would dismantle. It was also necessary. It was the piece that could be done by a person standing where you were standing, in the knowledge available at the time with the tools that existed. No more, no less. The legacy of the medieval plague doctor is not the cures, because there weren't any. It is the presence. The stubborn, poorly compensated, aromatic, glass-eyed presence in the places where presence was needed and most people were choosing to be somewhere else. The mask goes back on. There are still houses to visit. The epidemic is receding, but it has not fully receded, and the people in those houses still need the thing that you have always been able to provide more reliably than theriac or bloodletting or advice about chickens. The evidence repeated daily that someone is coming, that the door will open, that the figure in the crow mask and the waxed robe will appear at the end of the street and walk toward the house rather than away from it. That is what you leave behind. That is the whole of the legacy, and it is enough. And now, let the story settle around you like the last of the evening light through a window left slightly open. You can feel the weight of all those streets and all those rooms and all those faces beginning to soften at the edges, the way vivid things do when the mind is ready to rest. The plague doctor is stepping back now, into the amber-tinged distance of history, the beak mask lowering, the glass eyes going dark, the waxed robe folding itself into the past where it belongs. You did something remarkable tonight. You walked through one of the worst catastrophes in human history and came out the other side. Not unscathed, not triumphant, but present. Still here. The same stubborn aliveness that carried those medieval physicians through their impossible days is the thing that carried you through this one, and it deserves to rest now. Let the streets of the medieval city fade. Let the smell of lavender and cloves drift away on the soft current of air from your fan. Let the sounds of the epidemic, the distant voices, the closing of heavy doors, the careful footsteps on cobblestones, slow and quiet and finally stop, replaced by the ordinary sounds of wherever you are right now, which is safe and warm and very far from the 14th century. The figures in crow masks are gone. The crosses on the doors are gone. What remains is something quieter. The knowledge that ordinary people, in terrible times, with inadequate tools and wrong theories and insufficient pay, showed up anyway and did what they could. That is a very old and very human story, and it belongs to all of us, and it is a good thing to carry with you into sleep. Let your breathing slow now. Let the day go. Let everything that is heavy find somewhere to rest for the night. You were there, and now you are here, and here is good. Sweet dreams.